All right, welcome back. Firehouse Vigilance, Corley Moore here. Weekly scrap. Number 8, the landlord versus ownership. As always, getting started, I love to hear where you are watching from. If you are watching live, if you're catching it on YouTube or as a recording later, let me know where you're watching at. I love to see the comments. I love interacting with you and finding out where you are. Other thing I want to know is who has suggested reading for me to do. I'm really always looking for new books to check out on leadership, and I need to hear from you what I should be reading. So make sure and post those. Let me know what I should be checking out. I'm really excited about my next book I get to read, which is Call Sign Chaos, the one I just got in about General Mattis. Just published it last month. I know I talked about it last time. I'm super excited to get to it. And then I've also got stacked up 9 Lies About Work and a book called Fearless that was suggested to me. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those and reading those. Before we get going on today's scrap, I wanted to clear up a misconception that was brought to me. And that is, I talk a lot about the books I read, and I try to do a book review on almost every scrap. And the scraps I do, and the topics of the scraps and the discussion and all of that is... It's unrelated to the books I talk about. So I might be able to make it clearer by lining the books up with the topic. But the books I suggest are just books I'm very hyped and excited about or I love from some of my favorites and sharing them with you. And of course, they affect these topics. Almost every one of these topics are affected by the books I have read. So I hope I'm making sense. But when I do talk about a book, like last time I talked about Turn the Ship Around at the beginning, that doesn't mean that's what the topic of the conversation of the scrap is about today. So someone brought that to my attention, that they were confused by that. So I just wanted to clear that up. They're not related. Hope I'm making sense. Last week I said that this scrap was going to be about identity and your identity in your fire service and what was important to your identity in the fire service. But really that one's still in the incubator. I'm still cooking the topics of that one and the points of it along. And so basically in a nutshell, I lied to you. That's not what this one is going to be about this week. This week, it's all about ownership, a huge buzzword in the fire service, in leadership in general. Lots of books been written on ownership, and it comes from a conversation I was having in a firehouse just last week, and the trying to get the statement correct, but it was, how can you expect ownership if the guys on the line are only allowed to lease? And so that sparked this whole idea and this rabbit hole I went down to come up with this scrap. So let's talk about ownership and what do I mean by ownership. It's like I said, it's a huge buzzword in management, in leadership, in books, in motivation. Jocko, you can't knock Extreme Ownership. It's one of the best books written in the last 10 years. Extreme Ownership is an amazing, I love it. I would suggest anybody to read it. And ownership is a huge buzzword. And if you talk principles, Ray Dalio, Neuron Leadership, David Goggins' Can't Hurt Me, McRaven's Make Your Bed, Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, all of these, if not specifically about the topic of ownership, are definitely along those lines in the principles of ownership, personal ownership, and taking ownership of what you can control. It goes back to the circle of concern and circle of influence from my favorite author, Stephen Covey, and my favorite book, The 7 Habits. And that's all about ownership, and you can't go wrong with that. But that is a personal ownership that Jocko is talking about. It's about accountability, self-accountability, and taking control of what you can control and expanding your influence and your circle of effectiveness and increasing your effectiveness. It's a powerful message, and there is no doubt that has impacted thousands, if not millions of people across this world. And so I'm not downplaying ownership at all when I get to the topic that I'm talking about. But when I'm talking about ownership, that is not the type of ownership I'm talking about in today's scrap. What I am talking about is the landlord versus ownership. Leasing to own. So what do I mean? Am I being clear at all? Clear as mud, right? So let's get into it. Anyone who knows me, they know I'm a huge fan of Jocko. I've listened to the majority of his podcasts, and there are a lot of them. and I love both of his books. I haven't read the Warrior Kid stuff or the stuff that's made for the young adults. I'm sure the message is great. But I am a huge fan of him and his story of David Hackworth and About Face and all the work that David Hackworth did at his stint in Vietnam with the 439 and the hardcore Recondos. And if you don't know, I haven't read the Hackworth stuff myself. I mainly am know what Jocko's talked about it. So when I'm talking about that, he apparently took over one of the worst units in Vietnam. The morale was super low. And he came in and over time he turned that company around into a hardcore group of badasses that got busy getting stuff done. And how he did it and all the stuff that Jocko talks about him doing it, about establishing esprit de corps and infusing those troops with morale and making them, and discipline, of course, coming a huge part of that. But he had them doing stuff where an enlisted man would have to come up and salute an officer. Anytime he did that, he would say hardcore recondo. And the officer would immediately have to salute back and say, no fucking slack. And that is something that I don't know how you can infuse that kind of tradition, that kind of ownership, that kind of esprit de corps, that kind of morale building ownership. I hate to use the same term over and over, and infuse that into something other than by sheer force of will. Make no mistake, Hackworth was also, it wasn't just he came in and made up a bunch of traditions or ceremonies or and then said, here, go. He was very effective. He cut their casualties down and made them into effective fighting force. So you can't just go in and add ceremony and fluff and ribbons and expect guys to care. The meat and potatoes have to be there before guys can own it. So I want to look at Engine 54, Ladder 4, FDNY. You guys have probably seen pictures of them before. They are the theater district of FDNY. And on the front of Engine 54, I think it says something along the lines of never missed a performance. It's vinyl letters right across the front of the windshield. And Ladder 4, it says pride of Midtown. Now, I know that FDNY, huge, they've been around. Is there a bigger department? Is there more tradition and legacy than the FDNY? So I know that's there. But it's just the conversation we were actually having that sparked this whole scrap. These guys wanted to put a motto across their windshield like Engine 54 and Ladder 4 do at the FDNY. And they'd talk to their other shifts and everybody on that crew, and they wanted to make that happen on their engine. And they couldn't get approval for it up through the chain of command and down from administration. And that's what sparked the whole thing of how can you expect guys to take ownership if all they are is allowed to do is lease or rent. You know, and that's basically the comment that was made was we're just renters here at this fire station. You know, we're not allowed to put nails in the wall and hang pictures. And how can an administration expect ownership of or a culture to grow or there to be tradition and ceremony? And the next part I have this is what I wrestle with in my head is how do you establish that tradition and ceremony unless you establish a tradition and ceremony? And so it's something I wrestle with in my head, and I wanted to ask you guys what you thought and what was going on in your fire departments around the country. And I want to hear from you traditions and customs that have stood the test of time or have been newly founded and are trying to get going. I want to hear nicknames for engines and trucks, companies and crews and shifts. I want to hear if they have mottos, if they have slogans. I want to hear from you if you have a mascot or an emblem that is on your fire truck and the story behind it. Anything that makes you take pride and say, this is mine, this is what I belong to, this is who I am. I want to hear about it and see. I want to hear the story also behind the coolest one. So take your time and let me know. Send me a message, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Just hit me up and let me hear the stories behind what you got. And I want to know how you guys went about establishing that tradition or where it came from. Because I think that traditions and identity and esprit de corps is so important to the culture of the fire service, and that so many departments, especially as we move forward with these new fire stations that are built less like homes and more like offices. I know you guys have heard me rant on that before. That it's so important to stay connected to our roots and those traditions and establish those. So I want to hear from you what kind of traditions and ceremony and, I mean, rolling the rigs in and out. Certain, I don't want to say hazing because that's a bad word nowadays, but rituals involving when you get your gear on. There's so many cool ones I've heard just from talking to other guys, and I want to collect them, and I want to try and understand better how you get those established and make the guys, not make, or get the guys to care about them. And so do that for me, share them with me, and if you get a chance, if you want to understand everything I'm talking about, go to YouTube and look up Engine Company 7 Folklore, The Meaning of BMA. It's one of my favorite videos on YouTube. I love that guy when he talks, and I love that story of BMA, the best men around, and I'm going to try and steal it as best I can. So that's it. That's the weekly scrap. It's not really so much topics spit it at you so much as I want to hear what you guys think of traditions and esprit de corps, morale, and the culture of the fire service, and what the health of it is at your department, as well as what has stood the test of time for you. And so hit me back with that. As always, I update you on the Vigilant. We are at stalled still, 36 states. I printed off this sweet map so you can see it's backwards. Can you see through it? All right. Look at the United States backwards. Arizona, I'm calling you out. All up here in the Northeast, calling you out. We need Vigilant. We need the firefighters to join the Vigilant from these states. So if you know someone from these states that are not in the red, let them know they need to join the Vigilant. Sign the Vigilant Creed. Get on the Vigilant wall. 50 states is the original goal. We're almost there, so let's not stop now. Other than that, I promise the next scrap next week, I am going to be talking about identity, your identity at your fire station, and what it means. And it's still, like I said, it's still in the oven, kind of cooking, getting the points out that I want to get across. And as always, thanks for joining me on the weekly scrap. I hope the tone stays silent unless it's burning. Be safe.